Leading up to the release of the Silent Hill 2 remake, there has been many instances where I've sat contemplating whether I should play the original. Usually this would be a no-brainer. Of course I should play the original if I'm going to play the remake and make a video on it. But my brother convinced me to jump blindly into the Silent Hill remake, as it allows me to provide a rather unique perspective on the game. That being one whose vision is not obscured through nostalgic glazed eyes. Before we go any further, I just want to warn you that there might be some light spoilers, but I'm going to try to keep the story spoilers to a minimum. With that said, let's get into this one.
Mary. Could you really be in this town?
Silent Hill 2 is often regarded as the quintessential survival horror experience. Right up there with games like Resident Evil 2, Dead Space 2 or System Shock 2. Wow, a lot of 2s up there. Personally, I would put Alan Wake 2 and Evil Within 2 up there as well. But Silent Hill 2 is deeply revered by all fans of survival horror and a must play for anyone with a passing interest in the genre. Then you ask, how the hell has a horror game enthusiast not played Silent Hill 2 yet? Well, you see, I've been playing games for over 20 years, but I only beat my first real horror game in 2011. That game being Dead Space 2, another masterpiece in my opinion. Up to that point, I'd only dabbled in the genre by dipping my toes into games like Resistance, Resident Evil 5, and even Obscure 2. The keen-eyed gamers out there would notice that these are all co-op games, and the truth is, yeah, I was too chicken shit to play these games solo. The earliest memory I have of playing a horror game solo is Dead Space 1, and I remember noping out of that as soon as things got too intense. But getting back to my point of why I have not played Silent Hill 2 yet, is that my love for the genre is a relatively new one. Well, 13 years is not exactly a short time, and there has been many opportunities to tackle the Silent Hill series in that time span. The truth is, Silent Hill has never been a priority in my backlog of games, as the only ones I've played up to this point has been Downpour and Homecoming, arguably the worst entries in the series. So going back to the older ones was never truly on my mind. I never gave Silent Hill much thought. That is, until I played the Silent Hill 2 remake. Now I have to admit, when they revealed that first gameplay trailer, I had zero faith in this remake. But you have to understand, I was coming off the back of games like the Resident Evil 4 remake, the Dead Space remake, and Alan Wake 2. That first two games being extremely successful in updating beloved classics, and all three of which went above and beyond my expectations. But here comes Bloober Team, showcasing a game that, to me, looked half-baked and clunky. At this point, I was not impressed. But let me be clear, it's not the fact that Konami was publishing this game or the fact that Bloober was developing it. In fact, I really enjoyed the medium, and I was actually rooting for Bloober in this case. Cut to release day, where the reviews are flooding in and they are glowing, with so many reviews exclaiming how they were surprised that it didn't flop. This made me extremely skeptical, chalking these reviews up to a combination of low expectations and a heavy dose of nostalgia. And then I played it, and still I wasn't convinced, further cementing my theory of overhyped review scores. But I continued to play. At this point I was a few hours in and thought to myself, this gameplay is so clunky and the enemies are not really that intimidating. I distinctly remember thinking that it wasn't all that scary, because people always hype up Silent Hill talking about how sound design is so insane and super creepy, but still I wasn't convinced. If at this point I was forced to assign a score to this game, it would have been a 7. Not a bad score per se, it's a score I'd give a game like the rebooted Alone in the Dark, a game that I know was not exactly well received, but I thoroughly enjoyed. It was short, sweet, and chock full of interesting characters, mainly due to the endearing leads and the incredible voice work by the side characters. I bring this up because the game was shunned mostly due to its mediocre combat, and in my opinion, Silent Hill doesn't sit much higher in that regard. But getting back to my point, this game was turning out to be just okay in my eyes. But all that changed when I made it to Brookhaven Hospital. It was a combination of this area and the Toluca prison that was the turning point for me. Starting at the hospital, I began to truly appreciate what this game has to offer. The second I stepped into the lobby, my attention was immediately drawn to a pamphlet on a rack, and in it was a map layout of the hospital. Seeing the unexplored state of the facility began to stir within me a sense of a potentially thrilling mini-adventure, if that makes any sense. Being a huge fan of the Resident Evil series, it's easy to see how this kind of game design might appeal to my tastes. You see, a huge part of the Resident Evil series is familiarizing yourself with the layout of the level. Whether it be the Spencer Mansion in Resident Evil 1 or the police department from Resident Evil 2, you'll eventually become very familiar with your surroundings. The reason why I really enjoy this aspect of these games is because it's a kind of loop that starts off with the map being unexplored, at which point a potentially unseen threat could loom around every corner and every room. Though, as you explore the space and clear the area, you start to garner a sense of safety and security by making the unknown known. And in this perceived security, you tend to let your guard down, leaving you extremely vulnerable, at which point returning to cleared areas with the guard down leaves you perfectly primed for any shake-ups thrown your way. This loop of conflicted feelings between safety and fear is where I derive the most enjoyment out of horror games. And getting back to Silent Hill, I started to notice this kind of level design that perpetuates that kind of gameplay loop. Now, I'm not saying Silent Hill is copying Resident Evil, or vice versa. I'm just pointing out the similarities between the two. Though I will say, Silent Hill 2 offers a more diverse arrangement of locations. From the foggy streets of Silent Hill through the unnerving hallways of a dark prison to the hellish landscape of a labyrinth, each area becoming more eerie and unfriendly to the player. On top of that, I want to add, I was genuinely impressed by the level design of all these locations. Expansive as they are, it was always clear to me which way progresses the level and which way was just a side path, and did so without making it overtly obvious. Silent Hill's biggest strength lies in its story, and considering the fact that this would be my first time seeing it, I imagine my experience would have been very different to almost all of you watching this video. Chances are you've already played through the story at least once and are already aware of all the beats. So for you, it's just a matter of enjoying the updated combat and the fresh new visuals in all its glory. As a newcomer, it's hard not to take the early story beats as nonsensical bullshit. I guess that's by design, but I'm someone who tends to check out if I can't make sense of any situation. But as the story went on and I learned about the true nature of this town, things became way more interesting and I became more invested. I also learned that the enemies all have reason for their design, which is pretty cool because it gives the game an extra layer of depth. Learning about the symbolism behind something like Pyramid Head was really eye-opening when you consider his role in the game. Look, I'm not gonna even attempt to break down the meaning of this game, because I'll just butcher it and wouldn't do it any justice. But I want to shout out deep dives on the video breaking down the game, and I highly recommend you check it out after playing the game, as it gives you a deeper appreciation for the story. Personally, I can say for sure this is one of the best stories I've experienced in a very long time. Alright, let's get into some pros and cons, because as much as I've fallen in love with this game, there are a few things that hold this one from greatness. Let's start off with enemies. I know I just praised the game for having actual meaning behind the enemies' designs, but I gotta admit, fighting the same handful of enemies over and over again got a bit stale. This was especially noticeable in the first half of the game, where you're introduced to nearly all the enemy types early on, and there's no new surprises until the second half. Look, I know saying Silent Hill 2 is imperfect is blasphemy, but I believe even a masterpiece can be improved, no matter how small the improvement. And one small way I believe this could be achieved is by adding a bit more enemy variety. With our protagonist having such a broken psyche, I'm sure there's a few ways we can manifest this as enemies. And while we're on the topic of enemies, my favorite aspect of this game, above and beyond all, is the mannequin enemy. Now, I don't know how they behave in the OG Silent Hill. Like I said, I haven't played it yet, but I absolutely adore their AI or behavior in this remake. These things would attempt to ambush you at every turn, by hiding around corners, behind furniture, under tables, sometimes hiding in plain sight. And when you would suss them out, they would quickly try to reposition themselves in another room. This to me is incredibly brilliant enemy design, and an insanely clever tool for a horror game. And did I mention, even though your radio is meant to build up static when you approach an enemy, it will not register these assholes as long as they are in a hiding state. This means you can easily turn the corner without caution, only to be instantly jumped by one of these things. Trust me, after getting jumped a few times, you'll soon be checking every corner of the room like a paranoid crack addict. These things single-handedly drew out my playtime, because I was forced to meticulously examine the furniture at every turn. I'm honestly baffled how this kind of enemy design has not been implemented in other horror games. Alright, I think it's time we address the elephant in the room. Why are the nurses so goddamn sexy? Nah, I'm kidding. Of course I'm talking about the combat. The melee combat specifically. As far as the shooting goes, I think it's perfectly fine. Shots have a sufficiently satisfying punch. Don't get me wrong, it doesn't have the crunchy pop of Resident Evil 4 or the crack of Alan Wake 2's guns, but it's good enough. Unfortunately, you're gonna find yourself in close range combat for most of these encounters, and that's arguably the weakest aspect of this game. To me, the combat has always looked janky, since the reveal trailer, and honestly, even after getting my hands on the game, I feel the same way. Combat feels target locked and strangely loose at the same time. It's a bit hard to describe, but doesn't feel great. The best way I can describe it is if the Callisto Protocol and Last of Us had a baby and it felt less locked in, you know what I mean? Plus, on top of that, in tight spaces, the camera would sometimes get stuck on walls, make it feel even more clunky. Look, I know defenders will say that the combat is meant to feel crap to add an extra layer of tension and panic. To me, that sounds like making excuses for bad design. And I get it, we tend to protect the things we love, even if the means are a tad irrational. But if we keep turning a blind eye to innovation and keep on telling ourselves that it adds to the experience, then we'd still be using tank controls in our horror games. And be honest with yourself, do you really prefer tank controls? That being said, even though I consider the melee combat the weakest part of the game, it's not the worst thing ever. In fact, I would consider it to be very much serviceable. Look, there's a reason why most horror games stick to gunplay for the most part. It's kinda hard to do melee combat well, while trying to make the player feel underpowered and capable at the same time. It's a tough balancing act to pull off, and to be honest, there's no game in recent memory that manages to do this well. Funny enough, Condemned 2 comes to mind. But it's been a decade and some change, so I don't know if that game still holds up to today's standards. Maybe I'm being too harsh in this game, but I just finished God of War Ragnarok, and the combat in that has ruined combat for me in most games now. Nevertheless, I've yet to see a good survival horror game with well implemented melee combat. Resources. I'm gonna flash a screenshot at you that I captured at the very end of the game. Just before the final encounter, in fact. Now let me ask you, should I have 32 regular heals and 16 full heals at any point of a survival horror game? The correct answer is no. Saying I was well stocked throughout my playthrough is an understatement. This game throws resources at you left, right and center. Needless to say, there was never any real threat to my character's survivability. Any dread I felt was mostly due to the fact that I'm a huge chicken. But in terms of dying, there was never any actual panic in combat. There was one point in the whole game where I felt that threat, and that was because you were forced to give up all your items for a short while. This was the only section in the game where I felt I had to be careful. Pumping the play with consumables removes that survival aspect of the survival horror theme. A shortage of supplies can make for extremely tense moments. If you've ever played The Last of Us on grounded mode, you'll know that finding a bullet is a godsend, and having 3 bullets and a brick is considered a safe cushion. Now, I don't need Silent Hill 2 to take it to that extremes, but having fewer resources would have without a doubt added to the dread factor. I should note that I played with combat and puzzles both set to normal. This was the intended setting as per the vision behind the Silent Hill 2 remake apparently. I also know that playing on hard difficulty still gets you plenty of resources, but you probably burn through them faster, so maybe hard is the way to go. Silent Hill 2 has truly taken me by surprise. I did not expect to love this game as much as I did. Usually, I can look at a game's trailer and gauge whether I'll like it or not. I've never been proven wrong before in that way, until I played this game. But I will say, I was mostly correct in my initial feeling of this game, because what I saw was what I got. A sort of clunky survival horror with a somewhat weird convoluted story. But what I didn't account for was how deep the atmosphere would get its clutches into me, or how compelling the story was, or how deep-rooted trauma is in the symbolism and design of this world. Silent Hill 2 is no doubt a masterpiece, and I'm excited to see where they take the franchise from here. This time, not as a horror game enthusiast, but as a fan. Alright, that's it for this one. You know what to do, leave a like, and tell me in the comments, what do you think of the Silent Hill 2 remake? I thought it was absolutely brilliant. But that's it for me. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye bye.